You're a pro-independence party. The polls, though, have shown a bit of a slide in support for independence over the last few days. No's now saying 53%, yes 47%. Have you backed the wrong horse here?
The important part of this election and what our manifesto talks about is the recovery from the pandemic. That's the context that we're all living in. We desperately need a fair and green recovery from the pandemic, creation of jobs, upgrading of Scotland's homes, and of course, tackling the climate crisis. What we're looking at in this election is the right of the Scottish people to make the decision about who makes those decisions. So what we're looking at is asking for a referendum. And given that we have had a pro-independence majority in Parliament all this while, and we expect, with the help of the Scottish Greens, to have a pro-independence majority in the next Parliament as well, we think the people of Scotland have the right to decide who's going to be making decisions about their recovery. Is it the Brexiteer Tories in London, or is it a government in Scotland that we've actually elected?
But isn't it a distraction to be arguing about all this? Because, as you say, there is so much that needs to be done after COVID. It doesn't make sense to use political time to go over this debate when there was already a referendum and we were told it was a once-in-a-generation event.
Democracy is a process of governing by consent. And as with any discussion on consent, you need to check in regularly to see whether people are still happy with the direction of travel. It's very important to hold governments to account. And I think that a lot of people in Scotland have deep concerns about the direction of travel of the UK. The Home Office making life more dangerous and unpleasant for refugees, cutting off positive relationships with the EU. We seem to be alienating our nearest neighbours. We're making a fool of ourselves on the international stage by calling people who are concerned about the climate crisis bunny huggers. The direction of travel of the UK is deeply concerning. And when Boris Johnson thinks a recovery means buying more nuclear weapons while at the same time cutting public services and seeing that nurses only get a 1% pay rise, I think it's very reasonable to ask the people of Scotland, do you want to go along with this? Or do you think we can do something better? Do we think we can invest in a more progressive, in a fair, more welcoming Scotland? Is that the kind of country you want to live in?
Well, in terms of being more progressive, one of the things that the Green Party's embraced is something called the Yogyakarta principles. Why has the Green Party decided to support these? They have no standing in international law and they've not been adopted internationally in any treaty. It's about trans rights, isn't it? And it's about ensuring that people are not discriminated against because of their gender. But there are a lot of people who have many reservations about these principles in particular.
The Scottish Green Party, like Green parties all around the world, is based upon 4 principles: sustainability, equality, radical local democracy, and we need to make sure that all humans have fair human rights. And that is a core part of what we believe in. We do not believe that trans rights are counter to women's rights. All humans have the same human rights. So of course, when trans people gain human rights, or we make sure that their human rights are respected, we don't take away the rights from anyone else.
But you see,
absolutely, we need to make sure that trans rights are respected.
A lot of women are concerned that if you remove sex from a lot of documentation, it jeopardises the provision of single-sex spaces that women have had to fight to receive. Principle 31 of the Yogyakarta Principles specifically says ensure that official identity documents only include personal information that's relevant, reasonable and necessary. End the registration of sex and gender of a person in identity documents such as birth certificates, passports, etc. I mean, do you think people in Scotland really don't want the sex of their child recorded on a birth certificate? Because that is relevant to medical treatment that child.
Changing the. We can get into the technical detail of the interpretation of that exact bit of wording in that document.
Well, your manifesto says enshrine the Yogyakarta Principles in Scots law.
We are not talking about removing the sex from a birth certificate. That is absolutely not what we're talking about. That law is meant to refer to identity documents in countries where your identity document has to have your sex or gender on it so that you can access your civil rights. We don't have identity papers like that in Scotland. You don't have to use your birth certificate to access civil rights. It's sort of one of those sort of technical details, but we are absolutely not talking about removing sex from birth certificates. That is not what we're proposing at all.
Is the manifesto wrong then? Because it does say that it will enshrine the Yogyakarta principles into Scots law. So
the way you've interpreted
incorrect?
that line of that particular that you've read out there is not how we would interpret that. That is about having the correct gender on your documentation. And that means people should absolutely be able to identify their gender as they do already on their passport, on their driver's license. We're not proposing to change that. That's already in law. You can change the gender on your passport or your driver's license to make it match your self-identified gender. We already have that in the UK. We already have the Gender Recognition Act that says that, you know, if you follow the process to get a gender recognition certificate, you can then also change the gender on your birth certificate. That is what is in law, and that is what we would like to see kept. The only change we would like to see to that is the change to the Gender Recognition Act to make that process a little bit more humane, to make it a little bit more straightforward. At the moment, it's very medicalized, it's very hostile. It means that a lot of people who would really like to change their documentation to make sure it's correct don't do so because the process is so unpleasant. It's a very, very small change that we're wanting.
So what reassurance can you give to women in Scotland that under a Green Party leadership, the provision of single-sex services won't be implemented, and that, for example, if a woman goes to a rape centre, she won't necessarily have to be examined by somebody who was born a man?
The Scottish Greens follow the advice of women's groups in Scotland, End Gender Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, all these charities and campaigns that work for women's rights. We follow their guidance and their advice, and this is what we always do. We follow the advice of experts and women's groups. We know that what you fear there isn't what's going to happen. There is no concern about women not giving consent for being medically examined. It's an absolute, it's one of these dog whistle things against trans rights, this sort of terrible fear that a traumatized woman would be re-traumatized by a rape crisis center. That is not what rape crisis centers are there for. Rape crisis centers are there to support women and trans people and anybody who's been traumatized in those circumstances. But we also have to respect the human rights of people who work in those centers and people who give those support services. So we absolutely are, you know, women do absolutely have the right to consent. You know, you need to have consent before you can medically examine someone. There isn't a question around allowing women to be unsafe and traumatized by rape, you know, when they access rape crisis centers. We always follow the advice of Rape Crisis Scotland and End Gender and other women's groups to make sure that women are properly protected. And that means trans women as well, because trans women also need to be able to access these services safely.